100% lucky hit chance effectively right now.
I need more time.
Whoa. Whoa. Rank 19 corpse explosion. Now, there's only one way I would get up to this number, and if it's I finally fell to the dark side and started using Black River. I'll admit it. I'm doing it. It's crazy good. Actually, it's completely and utterly equatable to my normal Infinimist build. They're both wildly more powerful with the addition of this ring, and I'm going to go over how I've changed both of those builds, and I will finally be adding a Black River setup to the Infinimist guide on max roll. But let's go ahead and watch kind of side-by-side video footage. I ran the exact same dungeon multiple times on both builds, and I think the most interesting thing that has come out of the introduction of this ring is the fact that you just don't use Howl from Below anymore. So Ring of the Sacrilegious Soul turns out to not be as powerful as we thought it was as far as the stats are concerned. Turns out the tooltip that we saw with this ring just was not accurate. But what's important to note is that it still can roll a higher than average lucky hit chance on this ring. Meaning whereas you used to get 9% lucky hit chance on a perfect ring, you can now get 13.5. So just being able to get an additional 4.5 lucky hit chance actually is a lot more significant than you may originally have noticed, because it helps you to kind of fine tune a build that's looking to get just a little bit more efficiency out of all of its various procs. The great part about the ring is that while it doesn't roll over max life or essence or the corpse skills, you can still get up to 3 ranks once it's fully upgraded. You can still get the maximum roll of life when it's fully upgraded. And then the automatic ability to be able to use Corpse Tendrils and Corpse Explosion makes every version of the Infinimist build, whether you're more crit focused and you're looking to use Grasping Veins, or if you're more Corpse Explosion damage focused using Black River and Exhumation Glyph, you're going to get a huge amount of additional bang for your buck, and it's helped to drastically increase the overall efficiency, ease of gameplay, and total damage output for both builds. Now for both of my versions, I'm still running X-Fall's Corroded Signet, because it turns out that just being able to have a massive explosion of additional damage once everything is clumped up is really good, regardless of whether or not you're focusing on the corpse damage or trying to proc X-Falls as aggressively as possible. Now you'll notice in the gameplay for both builds, by the time I'm done with the optimization, I've actually made 2 huge changes to it that might make you think, how is this possibly still an Infinimist build? Most notably, one, we're no longer using Howl from Below. Howl from Below is actually going to be fantastic still for any speed farming or outdoor farming experiences where you're typically doing events where the monsters are spread out. Being able to force your corpse explosions to go run after them is such a huge quality of life that you absolutely can't replace it. The moment that we're talking about any nightmare dungeon though, where the monsters are always clumped up in huge density, or you're fighting against a boss, even though there's some very mobile bosses, Howl from Below is just not picking up the slack that it needs to and really isn't an optimal choice. We've also lost Explosive Mist. It just turns out that if your Blood Mist is eating corpses and the ring is eating corpses, a lot of the time when you come out of Blood Mist, you lose out on the opportunity to be able to use Corpse Tendrils proactively. And against endgame bosses, the constant consumption of corpses was making it so that Black River could never proc off of multiple corpses. So while these things will continue to have an absolute use in the early, mid, and even into the endgame, and on the base standard variant version of the build, I think once you're moving into these nightmare dungeon pushing and boss farming specs, that you just don't need these 2 staples of the build, which is really interesting. I never thought that it would take Explosive Mist off of the build. And while we have always found some opportunities to be able to remove Howl from Below, I just thought that it was so effective and automated so many things that you would basically see it until the end of days, or if they nerfed it or changed something very important about how the game works. And with the addition of the Ring of Sacrilegious Soul, they've effectively done that. Now what I want to do for you, and this is actually pretty simple since it works on both the Infinimist version that you've always known and loved with the wand, as well as on Black River, I want to show you how I have these things set up and the overall stats that you're looking for on your gear, and then how I have the skill tree, the Book of the Dead, and obviously the Paragon boards. But again, all of this is currently available in the D4 planners that I've already updated, and I've updated them based off of our testing today. But on top of that, I will be getting this updated into the max roll guide once we get done with all of our final trial testing, but I've put a lot of hours into this. I feel very good about it. So let's go ahead and start with the skill tree. It's pretty standard. If you've already looked at this build before, you're not going to see anything new, but I do want to cover it just for people who haven't seen it previously. As always, I will have timestamps down to every single thing below, anything that you need to go check. If you're a returning veteran, if you're just looking to see how I've optimized and theory crafted it differently, hop around to whatever you want to. I won't be offended in any way. The video is for you, it's not for me. In the skill tree, like I said, it's going to be pretty common across the board, but we're using Reap with the ability to generate corpses, still maxing out Hued Flesh, maxing out Blood Mist, which becomes more important to do, especially when you remove Explosive Mist, the ability to generate corpses from it, and then maxing out Corpse Explosion on every version of the build, as well as Blighted Corpse Explosion. Here, the only 1 point into Grim Harvest, we don't need Essence, and then maxing out Fueled by Death as well. Decrepify with Abhorrent Decrepify, maxing out Amplified Damage, and Death's Embrace. And then here is where you might actually see something a little bit different. We are just not putting additional points into Corpse Tendrils, and you'll see here with a single rank in it, and then 13 ranks from my gear, I have cooldown down at 4.97 seconds. Now, if we were to remove Black River, this number is going to look a little bit different at 5.43 seconds, but you basically are getting so much additional value out of the Ring of the Sacrilegious that you don't need to put any additional points into this for its own cooldown. Maxing out everything in the Shadow Tree, I have personally removed my points from Inspiring Leader. I don't think that's necessarily wrong to have the points in Inspiring Leader and remove a couple from Terror, just because this takes so long to be applied to targets. We're just kind of running and gunning the whole time, so I do like the attack speed, but at this point, I don't necessarily think that it's optimal. It might be on a speed farming version of the build, but still maxing out Standalone, Memento Mori, and then obviously Bone Storm with Supreme Bone Storm, and then Shadow Blight. Very quickly touching on the Book of the Dead, obviously Reapers to get the additional Shadow damage multiplier here, the additional Vulnerable damage multiplier here, and the additional Crit damage multiplier. Again, if you were on a speed farming version of the build, you could always use attack speed here. But now that we've seen the skill tree, let's go ahead and look at the gear, and I'll swap between the Black River setup and the Wand setup so you can see the difference. So here, this timestamp, Black River. Don't interchange these things. The aspects are kind of wildly different. So just like keep this focused here. Obviously Black River, the Ding Dang Duriel hasn't dropped one. So this is the best one that I got. So the Black River version of the build is still missing a little bit of power here, considering the item power becomes more important when you're relying on Corpse Explosion damage, since that's going to be based off your weapon damage, whereas X-Falls damage doesn't care about your weapon damage. On the offhand, we are still using Blood Soaked. I've tried running this build now without Blood Soaked, and I think it's just strictly wrong. Blood Soaked is so important for your lucky hit chance procs, your continuous procking of Blighted and Shadow Blight, and just being able to stack as many damage effects as possible. Blood Soaked is bare minimum required on the build, and then on top of that, it allows you to use Blood Mist as a movement skill, and I think that people are undervaluing just how important that is. Now for the actual focus itself, I've noticed that we kill monsters too quickly. Because of that, it's much harder to be permanently in Infinimist, which is something that I never thought I would say on the build. Regardless of how much lucky hit chance you have, regardless of how much cooldown reduction you have, sometimes you're just not in Blood Mist, and that's okay. But what it means is that we need to focus on our survivability a bit more, and especially with the Abattoir of Zir coming, where monsters are just going to get harder and harder and harder, and it's going to get harder to survive. Not only are we going to be able to be in Blood Mist more often there, if monsters are literally harder to kill, it'll take longer to kill them, so you're able to proc your lucky hit more often. But I definitely think that the offhand needs to start prioritizing some damage reduction. So lucky hit chance with barrier, cooldown reduction versus crit chance. It kind of depends on what you're focusing on. And then damage reduction on here. I love the damage reduction to shadowed targets. I think it's the best option. Starting with the helmet, lucky hit chance, total armor, maximum life, and cooldown reduction, required stats across the board. So many people ask me, would you use a Shako? How do I use a Shako? Would you use a Shako? I just wouldn't, if I'm being honest with you. Now, on the Black River version of the build, you can get away with using the Shako. It'll give you an additional 44% damage on your Corpse Explosion, which at that point is representative of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, roughly a 14% damage increase, somewhere between 14 to 15% damage increase. It's not terrible, it will work well, but I think that the lucky hit chance while you have barrier up is just so important on the build across the board. And then because we don't have Explosive Mist, you can either run Protector, which I'm kind of messing around with as an additional option to generate barrier in case Bone Storm doesn't have maximum uptime, and to be able to rely on lucky hit with barrier more often. You can also just go with Might, because Might just says 6 seconds of 20% damage reduction, and then it's basically build your Shako at home. I definitely think that Might ultimately will be the best option, but I am messing around with this one here. For the chest, this is where you want to put Shielding Storm because you will very often be swapping out your pants for a boss killing or speed farming setup. And then you want maximum life, total armor, damage reduction, and damage reduction. I prefer damage reduction from close and shadowed. Plain damage reduction would be okay, and then damage reduction while fortified if you're using the exhumation glyph isn't terrible, but I would almost prefer damage reduction from distant enemies if I couldn't get the other two. For the gloves, this is very interesting. Again, we're not using Howl from Below anymore on the pushing version of the build. You can still use it on your more casual version if you're speed farming tier 70s, if you're doing Helltide, Blood Harvest, outdoor content, whatever. But we want attack speed, critical strike chance, and then lucky hit chance. The other stat on the gloves is kind of up to interpretation. You can go with shadow damage. You can also go with crit chance versus injured targets, just be able to close out fights, especially against tanky elites. But those first three stats are absolutely core to the build. And then this on the Black River version is where I have Ultimate Shadow. You can interchange Ultimate Shadow between these two pieces. It kind of doesn't matter. But if you want to be using a Lidless wall on this build as well, I would move Blood Soaked up to here. And I guess I would sacrifice Ultimate Shadow. I don't know. I don't think you should use Lidless while on the build, but if you really want to, you definitely can. Honestly, if you're looking to get better uptime on Bone Storm, just swap over to Flicker Step and then use that instead. For the pants, we have Disobedience, because on a boss, we don't necessarily care about that additional armor. They don't really do a lot of damage, but here you want to have maximum life and total armor. Damage reduction from close, I think, is your best option, or damage reduction from shadowed. And then I'm currently using 4 ranks of Corpse Explosion on both versions of the build. If you just wanted more tankiness, you could replace that, but definitely on Black River, the highest rank possible in Corpse Explosion is going to net you the highest damage possible. For the boots, movement speed, corpse tendrils, and then I really like dodge chance and resistances. I literally found perfect boots that have corpse tendrils, movement speed, dodge chance, and they didn't have maximum evade charges on them, and I just didn't notice it for a while. And then a little bit into our testing, I was sitting there trying to figure out why I was missing so much mobility. You definitely want +3 to maximum evade charges here. And then I'm still using Ghost Walker. I did think originally on the Black River version you would need to use Greaves of the Empty Tomb for the additional lucky hit chance. I just don't think that that's true, although they are still a great version of this build where you get to benefit from the damage reduction as well, which might become more important in the Abattoir, but I think that these boots right here with Ghost Walker make it so that we maintain the highest mobility possible so we can spread our damage as fast as possible as well while we're in Blood Mist. For the amulet, this is currently spec'd for the Black River, so it's movement speed, lucky hit chance with barrier, total armor, and +3 ranks to corpse skills. Now that I've played around with the build a little bit, while I definitely like the lucky hit here, you could definitely go with Gloom for additional damage if you wanted to, and then either total armor or damage reduction I think are required stats here. This is where you're going to put Blighted. Then for the rings, people have been asking me a lot, like, is there any interplay with having a different range of times on the Ring of Sacrilegious? And it's kind of interesting. I think for Black River, having a 2-second corpse explosion might make boss kill speed actually a lot more fluid than what you currently have here, just because it consistently eating up your corpses means that you can never really benefit from generating a much larger total damage out of Black River. I may consider literally swapping over to an additional damage like Conceited Wand just for boss kill speed just with Black River. If you're using this ring, it's near impossible to actually set up enough corpses to benefit from this. Now that being said, if I had a 2-second version of the ring, I could bare minimum generate 2 corpses in between each one, and then at that point you're actually getting a damage multiplier from the aspect on Black River, so it might be worth it. Now it's going to be much different on the wand version of Infinimist, so I'll touch on this again when we look at that gear. And then obviously X-Falls. You can be using a legendary ring to put Decay back onto the build. I just think that X-Falls works. I think it's just the best option. I think pound for pound you get more damage output, better clear speed, and better tools to be able to increase your damage than any other ring that you could possibly put in here. Or if you were trying to somehow fit Lidless Wall in, so you still wanted Blood Soaked, you could use a legendary ring at that point, maximum life, critical strike chance, lucky hit chance, and then any other stat you really want. Damage to close would be a good option. Now for the wand version of the build, we regain an offensive aspect slot. Right now I'm running this wand, which is basically near perfect. So it has all stats, intelligence, vulnerable damage, and then damage over time. Remember that damage over time is going to help our corpse explosion damage, but also be a multiplier for our shadow blight damage. I think that I would prefer damage to shadow damage over time targets than vulnerable, or even damage to close. but I definitely think that this wand is like pretty near close to perfect, or might be a really good option if you're looking for it. Here's where I'm putting Ultimate Shadow when we're using a wand. The roll on the Ultimate Shadow isn't super important, but obviously having a maximum roll literally just makes you do more damage. Because we're able to fit that in, we can now run Grasping Veins on our gloves. This helps so much with the X-Falls damage, especially since Sacrilegious Ring is just maintaining our Corpse Tendrils buff more often. So we're able to literally stagger bosses faster, so we can benefit from staggering bosses and the cheating that we get to do with Vampiric Powers. But again, crit chance, lucky hit chance, attack speed, and then here's where I have crit chance against injured targets, and a perfect Grasping Veins roll. This helps for additional damage against the boss as well, since we're constantly reapplying that 1.4 damage multiplier against them. And then since I'm running this version, I would much prefer to have Gloom on the amulet than Corpse skills. But on this version of the setup, the near continuous proccing of both Grasping Veins and Corpse Explosion means that we are proccing X-Falls at an exceptional rate, so all of a sudden we regained a ton of additional clear speed against big clumps of tanky monsters, which is something that Black River typically handled better. And I do find that fighting a boss tends to be a lot smoother on this version of the build. Now I have timed out my boss kill speed again and again and again, and I use a boss swap, where I'm using Tybalt's Will for the additional damage multiplier, and then we are constantly applying the Accursed status so we can get the Flowing Veins bonuses on it. I swap out Anticipation for Terror, so now I have, when they are staggered, we have permanent crit time. And basically both versions of the build are killing bosses in under 30 seconds consistently, somewhere in like the 25 to 27 second range, just while kind of like testing and trying to nitpick and get everything perfect here. But for both of the versions of the build, again, I'm using Anticipation while we're just farming everything else, Prey on the Weak, Flowing Veins, Domination, and Metamorphosis, and then very specifically when I get to a boss, we throw on Terror. So again, when they stagger, we have all these crits. That X-Falls damage is going nutty, Shadow Blight's damage is going nutty, and Bone Storm's damage is getting that nice boost as well from its continuous damage over time. Now, the Paragon tree is going to look very slightly different between the two different builds, but I have it built so that either one can slot in at any given time. We're using Scourge in our starter board for a huge damage boost there. We are in the Wither board picking up just about everything, and then this is where we're running Control as a big damage multiplier whenever we stagger, as well as whenever we crowd control, which we're doing so much more often now. Over in Flesh Eater, obviously picking up the legendary node, and then this is Darkness for the biggest total additive damage bonus for all of our damage types. Building up into Scent of Death, we are using Essence Glyph because this will work again on either version of the build. Technically on the Black River version of it, it's not as valuable because you're not critting as often with it. So that being said, you could definitely swap this out for Imbiber if you really wanted just that additional additive boost. But a couple people are asking me about why would I possibly use this in the build based off our crit chance. Again, the moment that a monster is not healthy, we get a 1.22 damage multiplier for our X-Falls Explosion Ring, which is massive. Without doing like too much to like super amp up when it happens, I'm consistently critting for like over 8 million damage even against tier 100 bosses, so keep that in mind. X-Falls damage is absolutely bananas. To that end, we do pick up the Ruin node so that we do more damage against healthy targets so that they get out of the healthy status faster, so that Essence can proc against them more quickly in the fight so we can get more consistent damage out of it. And then over on the Bone Graft board is where your glyph is going to change. If you're running Black River and you want to, you can be using the Exhumation Glyph here. It's going to get you additional corpse skill damage, and it's going to benefit and give you a little bit more survivability by fortifying you and giving you damage reduction whenever you consume a corpse. If you're not using the Black River version, if you're using the Wand version, I highly recommend Territorial. Additional additive damage, which is applicable all the time since we're always close to our targets, as well as that 10% damage reduction all the time, even if you're not fortified. I think it can't be overstated just how valuable the Territorial Glyph is. So there you go. That is my total breakdown of how important and valuable and powerful the Sacrilegious Ring is across the board, regardless of what type of Infinimist you are playing. And I'm finally willing to let you know, yes, Black River, definitely good enough. Pretty equivalent gameplay loop. Again, I felt a little bit less safe on it than I would with just the base Infinimist build, and that's why I think that some people tend to try to build it a bit tankier, use Flicker Step, use Ozius Gale as well. I didn't find even in tier 100s like I was somehow magically dying all of the time, but I definitely felt like I had to play better to get more value out of it. It was cool to see like 3 million damage ticking dot damage from my corpse explosion whenever a boss or a monster was particularly tanky, and it actually spawned ads to get huge damage out of it, so I get why people like to use it. Hey, you know what, maybe If I were to find a perfect version of this weapon, maybe I'd start to feel a little bit better on it. But quite frankly, I think that this is good enough. It's a fine weapon. It's a good weapon. Definitely use it if you want to. Both of them feel really good. But I'm personally sticking with the wand. I just think that it was smoother. My damage application was more effective. I was able to kind of play around a bit more. I like to be able to watch stream and talk to chat and kind of be over here outside of the game as much as possible. And the wand just kind of let me do that more effortlessly. And then on top of that, it just allows you to have on more aspects, so you can kind of change your build up a bit more as opposed to having that restricted slot. While the Sacrilegious ring isn't as powerful as we thought, literally just because the affixes don't roll as high as we do, luckily enough, the lucky hit chance still rolls higher than you average would. The stats on it are absolutely phenomenal. I definitely think that it's a good addition to the game. If you have any questions, if you have any comments, if you have any feedback, if you have anything that you wanted me to cover in greater detail, please leave a comment down below. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. I really need to start doing this at the beginning of the video, but I figure people don't want to hear me shill for myself, so I just want to give it out to those diehard people who made it all the way to the end. If you haven't already, click that button. I'd really appreciate it. Go ahead and throw a like on the video as well, and thank you so much for watching this video. Quite honestly, I hope that this helps you in all of your theory crafting. I'm excited to see what builds and their relative power looks like moving into the new content that's coming in the game, and whether or not any of this swaps out or changes up the rankings in the tier list. But thank you very much for watching the video. I truly hope that it helps, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one.